Today, we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess you could call them the underlying structures of perception. I picked this image. It's a very old image. It's an image that portrays a man being cast up on the beach by a whale. It's Jonah, biblical figure. And in the story of Jonah, Jonah was out on a rough ocean storm, and he had been commanded by God to do something which he was ignoring. And the storm was sufficiently rough so that he got cast overboard. He was eaten by this giant. This is a whale as far as the medieval people were concerned. It's obviously not what we would think of as a whale, but they didn't know much about whales. Anyways, he was swallowed up by a whale and then cast back up on shore a number of days later. It's a death and rebirth story. And the reason I use it as an image is because it represents something of psychological import that you're all familiar with, but that you might not know that you're familiar with. Symbols are often like that. A symbol often stands for something that you know, but that you don't know that you know.
Hi, today I just want to talk about Jordan Peterson, and he's talking about the mythological aspects of personality. And I think it's terribly important. It's from one of his lecture series from, I think 2015. It's the second of his lecture series. So he gives a lecture series on personality. In the first lecture, he basically just introduces, and then the second one he's talking about the mythological aspects. So that was very worthwhile taking a look at, because if we want to understand personality, we have to understand where is it coming from. And we have to understand that there's a symbolic structure at play. So let's take a quick clip here and see what he's talking about.
There's lots of things that you know that you don't know that you know. Almost everything is like that, in fact. And it's rather obvious if you think about it, because if you were transparent to yourself and you knew everything you knew, you wouldn't have to study anything about psychology, because you'd understand yourself completely. And we understand ourselves poorly. And so we have to study ourselves as individuals, and then, as phenomena in the world, as other people, and as mammals, and as animals, and as living things, and as political actors, and so on, just to get some minor notion of what's actually going on. And what that means in part is that you're more complicated than you can understand. Now, this particular image is a journey to the underworld image, and that's a very, very old idea, journey to the underworld. It's maybe the oldest myth. It's one of the oldest mythological ideas, or one of the oldest archetypal ideas. And the underworld it's a difficult phenomena to grasp. Although you certainly encountered the concept, particularly in movies. So for most of you, how many of you have seen all the Harry Potter movies? Right. So right, of course. And so in the second movie, I believe it's the second movie where Potter encounters a basilisk underneath Hogwarts. Is that right? Is that the second one? Yeah, well, that story is a journey to the underworld story. And the architectural setup of the movie, by architectural setup, I mean the relationship of Hogwarts, the castle, to the underground structures, is a symbolic representation of the representation of consciousness embedded in culture. And so that would be Potter and his friends embedded in the realm of magical knowledge, so to speak, that's outside of them. And that's represented by the castle, which is, it's a representation of knowledge cast in stone. So that's a form of memory, to cast something in stone.
So he's talking here about Jonah and the whale's famous story from the Bible, where Jonah is taken by the whale and he comes out. And it's basically really a story about the underworld. And the underworld, he's going to basically start talking about Jungian psychology. And there's two kind of major famous schools of psychology. One is Freud, of course, with the unconscious mind, repression, and so on and so forth. And the other is the Jungian model. And Jungian is more aspirational. So he really talks about that you've got a conscious and unconscious and a collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is basically filled with all sorts of symbolic elements, which basically we could call mainly call archetypes, like the hero, the maiden, the old hag, like the wise person, and so on and so forth. These are symbolic aspects. And so when a movie, for example, or a story is very successful, it will have symbolic aspects. And he starts talking about Harry Potter. And why is Harry Potter very successful? One of the key reasons why Harry Potter is very successful was because it gives the example of the basilisk. It's really a journey into the underworld. So there's a lot of symbolic aspects. And so if we go back to the Greek stories, when I was a kid in school, we used to do a lot of Greek stories. And there's something about those myths. Now, if you're in a different culture, you'll have different myths. But if you actually look at them, you see a lot of similarities. For example, we've got the king of the gods in Greece is Zeus. You got the king of the gods in India, for example, is Indra. Okay, and both are as far as I remember, both are the king of wind, for example. So the same symbolic aspects keep coming up. Okay, and that's why if you look at the Greeks, they came up with the idea of comedy and tragedy. And when we talk about, there's a very famous guy, and he talked about he is talking about the hero's journey, and that's Joseph Campbell. He is an academic, and he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And basically, he's talking about how we need to go on a hero's journey. So why is the hero important? Because we feel that we're on a journey, and we hope that we are also the hero. So in the hero's journey, you kind of start as a character that has potential, but is not actualizing the potential fully. And then that character goes through a series of challenges, and they're expanding, but also dealing with challenges. And they come to kind of a medium point in the story where everything is getting out of hand. They got too many challenges, and they're actually backsliding, going backwards. And then they get to the stage, maybe at the end of the second act, where they're hitting rock bottom. And then, like the phoenix rising from the flames, another symbolic act, they come back out and they finish their story arc. That's the idea that Judge Campbell was talking about. And why a lot of modern, say, movies, for example, stories suck, is they don't really adhere to the hero's journey, and they kind of go all over the place. And a lot of them try to be clever, but they're missing the symbolic element. So for a movie to be successful, or a book to be successful, there has to be symbolic elements. If you listen to a song, or you watch a movie, or you read a book, and you keep going back to it over and over and over again, there's definitely a symbolic element in it. So what else does he say about these mythological aspects of personality?
That's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. Now, in the Potter situation, which is related to this image, the one that's up here, the idea is that everything that's stable rests on something that's unstable and dangerous. And that's underneath in the Potter series. And then the other thing that happens continually in the series, but particularly in the second episode, is that Potter has to go down beneath things to encounter something that's terrifying and deadly, that's actually preying on his friends and on the community. So it's very much like, for example, the Hobbit having to go off and steal treasure from Smog, I think the dragon's name is. And except that in the Potter sequence, the dragon, which is the basilisk, their equivalent, it's the same thing as this. In the Hobbit, the dragon hoards gold, whereas in the Potter representation, what does the basilisk guard? What is it captured? It's the little red-headed girl. Yeah. Right, Ginny. Right, and that's a very old story. Now Potter's kind of in love with her, right? Now, I mean, they're young and sort of platonic, but you can see the relationship sort of burgeoning. And now he has to confront this thing that's terrifying, that exists underneath everything, in order to free this virginal figure from the clutches of something terrible and reptilian. Now, it's a very, very interesting story, that. And what it means, a whole variety of things. And what it means to some degree is that a male human being can't really become mature until he confronts the terrible things that lie underneath the civilized veneer of society. That's one thing it means. Another thing it means is that it's the capacity of the male in that situation to do that that makes him attractive enough to wake up the females that he might be associated with. So that's like a Sleeping Beauty motif.
So he's basically talking about the Harry Potter story, Harry Potter overcoming this basilisk, and basically that for a man to mature, he's giving an example of that he needs to overcome some kind of inner demon in his life. And I think we could broaden that. He's talking about men, but we could broaden it to whether, regardless what gender you are, every human being has to deal with failure. And no human personality is complete unless they fail. And if you think about it logically, every human being on the planet fails at something. And if you haven't failed, you will fail. Whether it's failing at a career, failing at a sport, failing at a relationship, failing to make money, failing to do certain issues in life, failing to have mental success or emotional happiness, mental balance perhaps. Everybody has something that will come to them at some stage in life that they just can't deal with. And I think it's a very interesting idea that we have this analogy you might have heard of, that the thing that makes the pearl is a little bit of dirt gets into the clam, and it develops this kind of protective layer to protect itself, and that becomes the pearl. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it's a great story anyway. So the analogy of the pearl is that we have, the pearl of great prices, where that we have the pearls of wisdom that we get as human beings, that they come about from dealing with the undealable, that which we cannot overcome. And that while we want to be successful and we live in a society that's very focused on success, it's only when we come across something that we cannot easily overcome, when we have to face that challenge and really have to face that failure, that we grow in depth. So our depth of personality rarely comes from success, although sometimes it can come, but rarely comes from success. Usually our depth of personality actually comes from coping with failure and getting back up and dusting ourselves off. Of course, ideally in the stories and the movies and so on, we eventually win against the beast, as it were. We overcome, we become a great success, which gets back to Joseph Campbell's idea of a hero with 1,000 faces and the hero's journey. But regardless, whether we succeed or fail, it is that quirkiness of our personality that, like our personality is kind of thorny. There's no perfect personality. And in dealing with difficult situations, and that inevitable situation in our life that we're going to be a failure at something, whether, like I said, in money or relationships or whatever, and that even with a great deal of effort, we don't become, maybe we kind of overcome it, but we're not super successful at it. That's the making of the man, that's the making of the woman, that's the making of the person, is overcoming that challenge and becoming who you really are or who you're meant to be. And that doesn't necessarily mean being rich or famous or super successful or getting everything you want. But it does mean the fulfillment of you as a personality, that you become the person that you're kind of meant to be, or you become a bigger and better version of yourself. And so in this lecture, he goes on for well over an hour, and I'll probably do more videos and different aspects of it, because Jordan Peterson goes everywhere. I know some people love him and some people hate him, but from a psychological point of view, if you actually look at his videos, they're packed with huge amounts of information, and a lot of it is actually valid. Another one which I thought was very interesting in this video is where he talks about what you know and what you don't know.
There's lots of things that you know that you don't know that you know. Almost everything is like that, in fact. And it's rather obvious if you think about it, because if you were transparent to yourself and you knew everything you knew, you wouldn't have to study anything about psychology, because you'd understand yourself completely. And we understand ourselves poorly. And so we have to study ourselves as individuals, and then, as phenomena in the world, as other people, and as mammals, and as animals, and as living things, and as political actors, and so on, just to get some minor notion of what's actually going on. And what that means in part is that you're more complicated than you can understand.
So, it sounds like he's just saying very funny things, but it's very interesting, the idea that you don't know what you know, okay? And so you know, but you don't know that you know. And it sounds like it's a clever statement or a silly statement, but you're actually thinking very deeply. It's a very philosophical point of view. That you know something, but you don't know that you know. There's a nice scene in the first Matrix movie where Neo goes in, the hero story, he goes in to see this lady, the Oracle, and she tells him that he has what it takes, but he doesn't have the chops, as it were. And for a while, the next part of that movie, he thinks he's not really the real deal, and that Morpheus, who's sacrificing everything for him, does. And then he's faced with a situation where Morpheus is captured, and he's in a situation where he has to sacrifice, either Morpheus has to die, or he has to sacrifice his life, because Morpheus will not, give it the information over to these other guys. He'll die in the process of torture and so on. So at that moment, Neo is facing failure. He's told failure, because either he lets Morpheus die, which is a failure, or he goes to do the impossible, and he'll definitely die, because logically he should. Now, as it happens in the movie, his superpowers come out and so on, but he should die. So he's failing one way and failing the other way, but he decides to do the right thing, as it were, to go in and try his best to get Morpheus out. That moment is him facing failure. And that moment is that he knows what to do. He knows how to be the hero, but he doesn't know that he knows. And in that moment, he makes a decision, then he becomes the hero, then he becomes the man. He becomes the man not because he saved Morpheus. He becomes a man because he realizes that the only option is to save Morpheus. And that's, these moments of clarity and realization. This is where the symbolic aspects and the mythological aspects of personality come out, because really everything is a story. And you have a story, and I have a story, and everybody on the planet has a story. And when we start to see our life as a story, the story that we're telling ourselves, and that it has mythological aspects, that's why when we dream, okay, when we're dreaming, we're overcoming or going through layers and levels of thoughts, and a lot of it is obviously just cleaning the impressions of the day and processing stuff. But you ever notice that a lot of your dreams are kind of anxious, frustrated, and it's like you're trying to deal with something complex or difficult to deal with. Maybe there's some kind of embarrassment or fear or public failure or something. There's always these elements which are surprisingly, tenaciously minor in a way, because okay, if you dream of a tiger's trying to eat you and you're running away, fair enough. But a lot of the dreams we have, it's almost like we're just trying to deal with issues. And I feel that what's actually happening in the dream, apart from dealing with what impressions are today and the neurological cleaning and so on, is that the dream is us looking at our story. And that a big part of how we grow and develop as a personality is learning about our story and learning to change our story, learning to change the narrative that we say about ourselves. And that's a very, very important thing. That's where we get into the mythological aspects. So if you just see yourself, and sadly a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists and neurologists and neurological scientists just view human beings as a slab of meat and a bunch of behaviorists. Maybe there's not even a soul. Maybe there's not even a real consciousness. I mean, one of the very popular theories in neuroscience, believe it or not, is that your personality, your ego, your subconscious mind, your drives, your desires, are just an attempt of the body to keep itself alive. And that the personality is a side product of the biology of the brain, so that your body will go off and eat food and reproduce. And that's the most ridiculous theory I've ever heard. And it's absolutely ridiculous. So, if you start thinking yourself instead as perhaps a mythological creature, that every human being is a mythological creature, and that there's something behind the myth, it makes sense. One final point I'll just touch on, and I've touched on this in other videos, and I'll put it in as well, Jordan Peterson probably won't talk about this, or not the way I would talk about it, is that if we look at psychoanalysis, the effort is to go from metonymy to metaphor, from boredom to interest. And, from a Freudian point of view, we are very emotionally oppressed in order to fit in society, which slows us down. And so the way we grow and develop is that we find metaphor in our life, we find meaning. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, that the effort of life is about meaning. Of course, Jung was all into self-actualization, into people basically growing and developing and becoming who they really are. And that's when you see yourself as a mythological being, and that there's far more levels and there's an infinite possibility, and who we are is a very small version of who we could be, and there's actually no limits on who you could be or who I could be or anybody could be. We can be much, much bigger. And the sadness, the great sadness of human life isn't that we have wars and all that stuff. The great sadness is that we think we're slabs of meat. The great sadness is that we think we're limited. We have a lot of potential in us that we're not tapping. And a very key thing is the very conscious awareness that has you watching this video gives you the ability to partake in life and have a range, a perceptual range, which is far bigger than you realize, and a depth of experience and meaning, which is far bigger. And that's what I like about the point that he's saying in a very roundabout way, because how the hell do you talk about this subject anyway? And we just talked about 5 minutes about 1.5 hour lecture, which is basically that personality is mythological elements. And if you see yourself in a mythological way as a deeper human being with metaphor and meaning, you're going to have a lot more understanding of what it is to be a person, and that there's mythological elements to the story you're telling yourself, either negative or positive. And that a weird thing, if we really get deep into it, is that we need to change at these symbolic levels deep within us, thoughts, feelings, and ideas and beliefs we have to have of ourselves. We kind of have to slay the dragon within ourselves, even though there is no dragon. But symbolically, we have to overcome the limitation, because that's how the subconscious mind works. The subconscious mind thinks in symbols, and that we symbolically have to go through births and deaths, and we have to go into the underworld and come back out again. That's the mythological personality. So I might do more on this. Check out his video. His video is very interesting. The mythological aspects of personality. I hope you like this video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time.